I'll start out with the fact that I really want you to throw out your comments, questions, criticism. You can whatever your complaints. I welcome it all. The more conversation I create, the better I like it. I taught for 35 years, and the classes I enjoyed most were those where I could get the students to interact with me, and I hope you will take that in that spirit. And so hopefully my comments tonight will provoke some serious discussion and feedback. And basically I'm going to focus on that portion of my book that deals with the interaction between the civil rights movement, the burgeoning civil rights movement, and how the church reacted to the civil rights movement and how that impacted on the way that they dealt with the issue of black priesthood denial, because they were all interrelated. And that's the point that I really want to try to make with this presentation tonight. And as most of you are probably acquainted, if not having lived through it like I did, I'm one of the old guys here, and with my good friend, fellow Middavian Ford Stevenson out there. I hadn't seen him for years, and we went to high school together. We belonged to the same ward, and we're in the same Boy Scout troop, and I was just thrilled to see him come out tonight. That was part of the special treat, and that's when I first became aware of the issue of the blacks, the priesthood, and civil rights when I was growing up as a young boy in Midvale, Utah, which, it's a small community for those of you who are not Utah-oriented, north of Provo, south of Salt Lake City. And anyway, when I was growing up, the civil rights movement was well underway. And at that time, most religious denominations were reacting positively toward the quest for equality that was part of the civil rights movement. The black churches were particularly in the forefront of, notable people like the Reverend Martin Luther King, but white Christian churches, Catholics, Protestants, and Jewish denominations were also very much a part of the civil rights movement, which really gained momentum during the late 40s into the 50s and reached its crescendo during the 1960s. By contrast, however, the LDS Church held back. They did not become actively involved in the civil rights movement. In fact, there were a number of church leaders that were adamantly opposed to the quest for black equality. For example, J. Reuben Clark, who at the time was a member of the LDS Church First Presidency, warned that what he called the struggle to break down all race prejudice would lead directly to racial intermarriage. And this was the bugaboo that kind of underlined Mormon opposition to the civil rights movement. It all came down to miscegenation, intermarriage, and all of that. And that was that constant theme that you'll hear again and again and again among church leaders. And most adamant, even more adamant than J. Reuben Clark, was Apostle Mark E. Peterson, who in a 1954 BYU address called Race Problems and How They Affect the Church, he claimed that blacks were simply not seeking economic, social, and political rights, but sought complete absorption with the white race. Again, that bugaboo of miscegenation or racial intermixture. And then he went on to say this. He said that the segregation itself was divinely sanctioned. And this is how he pointed that out. I think the Lord segregated the Negro. And who is man to change that segregation? It reminds one of the scripture on marriage. What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. Only here we have the reverse thing, the opposite. What God hath separated, let not man bring together again. That's Mark E. Peterson. Peterson's address, you have to look at the context in which it was given. It was clearly a reaction to the United States Supreme Court's recently mandated Brown versus the Board of Education, which mandated the desegregation of public schools. Then, and echoing the same kind of sentiment, but not quite so emphatically, was Joseph Fielding Smith, who was a senior apostle at that time. He assailed or condemned what he called the wave of non-segregation. I like the way he put it. That's kind of a quaint way to say it. That was sweeping the country. And as I say, it came down to the same bugaboo. It's going to lead to racial intermarriage or amalgamation. Most significantly was the position of then LDS Church President David O. McKay. He expressed similar fears concerning the civil rights movement. And this came at a time when McKay conceded, I think this is an important point, McKay conceded that the church relationship with black people was one of its most pressing problems that really needed to be solved. He said this actually in private to BYU President Ernest L. Wilkinson in an exchange of letters that went back and forth. He didn't make this public, but he privately told President Wilkinson that the race issue was one of its most pressing issues that needed to be solved. But he didn't disclose this publicly. In fact, he actually condoned the ongoing segregation practices that were going on in Utah at that time, and most dramatically evident in the discriminatory practices imposed against blacks by the LDS Church-owned Hotel Utah. But even most outspoken, I guess the most outlander out there of the general authorities was then Apostle, future church president Ezra Taft Benson, who claimed that the civil rights movement was part of a communist plot to subvert American freedom. And Benson he was not shy about making his views on this point well known in a number of conference addresses delivered to the LDS General Conference throughout the 1960s. For example, in a 1963 conference address, he claimed that the civil rights movement had been fomented almost entirely by the communists. And 2 years later, he even became more emphatic. He says communists were using the civil rights movement, this is in 1965, to promote revolution and eventual takeover of the country. He warned his fellow Mormons, when are we going to wake up? What do you know about the dangerous civil rights movement in Mississippi? Do you fear the destruction of all vestiges of state government? He then concluded, brethren, if we had done our homework and were faithful, we could step forward at this time and help save the country. So he saw it as an existential threat. Benson was clearly reacting against the recent enactment of the landmark civil rights legislation that was passed during the mid-1960s, specifically the 1964 Civil Rights Act, barring all discrimination in public facilities, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, guaranteeing blacks equal access to the ballot and to voting rights. Benson was even equally influenced by another important aspect, and that was his close, intimate relationship with the John Birch Society, which was concurrently expressing similar fears. Benson was never a member of the society itself, this militantly anti-communist group, but his sons, two of his sons, Mark and Reed Benson, were national officers in the John Birch Society, and his wife, Flora, was also a card-carrying member of the Birch Society. And unfortunately for the LDS Church, Benson's comments, highly charged comments, brought unwanted, unwelcome national attention to the LDS Church and its increasingly controversial black priesthood ban. Closer to home, Benson's speech earned the ire of the Salt Lake City chapter of the NAACP, which called for a national resolution to asking all developing nations to refuse to grant visas to LDS missionaries and other church officials until such time as the church's doctrine of non-white inferiority is changed and rescinded, and a positive policy for civil rights taken. And in fact, the NAACP passed a unanimous resolution to that effect in July of 1965. But I hasten to point out that not all Latter-day Saints agreed with the anti-civil rights position of Benson and others in the church hierarchy. Taking a strong opposing position were a number of noteworthy high national profile Latter-day Saints. I've just mentioned three of the most prominent. One of those was Sterling M. McMurrin, a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah, who became Commissioner of Education under John F. Kennedy during the 1960s. He was in the forefront of speaking out against the position of Benson and others. A second equally noteworthy individual was Stuart Udall, who was a cabinet member. He was Secretary of Interior in the cabinet of John F. Kennedy, also during the early 1960s. And the third individual was yet another political figure. You may have heard the last name of this individual. His name was George Romney. You've probably heard the name Romney, I'm sure. And anyway, so at that time, the elder Romney, George Romney, was governor of Michigan. And throughout the 1960s, he was a leading figure within the Republican Party. Indeed, throughout the 1960s, he was consistently mentioned as a presidential contender, or as my good friend Marlon Brando would say, contender. Throughout, he could have been champion. He could have had class, but he didn't quite make it, even though he made a run for the presidency in 1968. He was considered actually the leading front runner in that 68 election, and the tragedy is that he was a guy who was very frank and very plain-spoken. He said we'd been brainwashed on the Vietnam War, and that undermined his chances. I always like to think about what-ifs American history. If he had been elected in 68 instead of Richard Nixon, but you know, I always love to do that with my students, what-ifs in American history. Well, anyway, also bringing pressure on the LDS Church was the NAACP, both alarmed and angry that Utah was the only Western state that had not passed laws guaranteeing basic civil rights for minority groups. The NAACP, in fact, threatened to picket Temple Square at the upcoming October 1963 LDS General Church Conference. Alarmed at this possibility, Hugh B. Brown and N. Eldon Tanner, both counselors in the church first presidency, met with the president of the Salt Lake NAACP, a man by the name of Albert Fritz. They had a frank discussion, and Brown, and I want you to remember the name Hugh B. Brown because he was by far the most enlightened member of the church hierarchy on the issue of race and civil rights. And Brown promised the NAACP that a statement concerning the church's position with regard to civil rights would be made at the upcoming conference, General Conference in 1963, October 1963. And so he actually carved out a statement affirming church support for civil rights, doing it in conjunction with Sterling McMurrin. They were very close to one another, and so together they drafted this statement. But the tricky part of all of this, they had the statement in hand, but they had to they had to get at least tacit approval, if not, at least non-opposition from the hardliners within the church hierarchy who were opposed to issues involving racial equality. And those in particular were Ezra Taft Benson, Joseph Fielding Smith, and Harold B. Lee. They were kind of pushing back from the other way. But Brown was fortunate because timing was on his side. And President McKay approved what he was doing. So he let Brown go forward with the statement that he had drafted. But he refused to let Brown present it as an official pronouncement of the first presidency. And the reason he didn't want Brown to make it look like it was an official pronouncement was out of deference to the hardliners, Smith, Lee, and Benson. And so President McKay specifically instructed Brown to present the document within the context of his longer conference address. Brown, however, being kind of a strong-willed personality and feeling very strong about this, ignored McKay's directive. Immediately after getting up in front of the conference, mounting the podium, he read the Civil Rights Statement and then paused for a very short period and before proceeding to his talk. Thus, Brown created the impression that what he had just read was indeed an official statement of church policy from the first presidency. Now, the statement itself declared the church support for full civil rights for blacks, stating the following: that it is a moral evil for any person or groups of persons to deny any human being the right to gainful employment, to full education opportunity, and to every privilege of citizenship. So, I mean, it's clear that by '63, the church had come a long ways regarding civil rights. And a lot of that effort can be given to Brown. However, Brown was much, much less successful in getting the church to rescind its odious policy of black priesthood denial. Because it was deeply entrenched and it was historic. And this was despite his untiring efforts throughout a whole decade. He spent the better part of the 1960s trying to push the church to change. But as I say, he had history against him on this one because the historic ban kind of went through a three-stage process. As you're probably aware, it didn't begin with Joseph Smith. It began with Brigham Young, and it started out as a practice and intertwined with the issue of slavery. And during the question and answer, I'll be able to go into that in a little bit more detail. But it started out as a practice under Brigham Young, and by the early 20th century, it had been so firmly established that the church proclaimed it to be a policy by the early part of the 20th century. That was the second phase that gave it added legitimacy. And then by the 1950s, it had been elevated to the status of a doctrine. And and when you say something's a doctrine, that is pretty definitive. And what made it a doctrine was a 1949 statement, official statement, issued by the church first presidency at that time. The president at that time was George Albert Smith, and his counselors, interestingly enough, were J. Reuben Clark and David O. McKay. And the 49 statement represents a hardening, added legitimacy, in that it said the following about the black priesthood denial. It said that black priesthood denial was a direct commandment from the Lord, founded on the doctrine, there's that word doctrine, of the church from the earliest days of its organization. In justifying the ban, the 49 statement referred to the pre-existence, referred to the conduct of spirits in the premortal existence, somehow implying the blacks were less valiant in the pre-existence. I remember in Sunday school and in church, well, they were actually neutrals, and that you know, it didn't. The statement didn't say that, but it intimated that somehow blacks were less valued in the pre-existence.
And can I ask you a question?
Well, when I get through, could I go ahead and finish? I'm almost finished. I got about a half a page, and and so it said that, but then it continued. The last part of the statement said it promised, quote, that the day will come when the black race will be redeemed and possess all the blessings we now have. But this will only occur when all the rest of the children of God have received their blessings in the holy priesthood. So in this last part of the statement, in trying to say when is it going to happen, they were quoting Brigham Young. This is what Brigham Young had taught in the 19th century. Thus, when President Brown undertook his crusade to lift the ban, as I say, history was clearly against him. And he faced the seemingly insurmountable task of persuading a majority of the church's ruling hierarchy to go along with lifting the ban. Despite this, Brown, being the crusader he was, pushed ahead over a 6-year period from 1963 through 69. In fact, in 1963, he thought he was going to be able to do it because he told a New York Times reporter named Wallace Turner that this indeed was about to happen. This was 63. And so the New York Times comes out with this banner headline: "The top leadership of the Mormon Church is seriously considering the abandonment of its historic policy of discrimination against Negroes." Obviously proved very premature. But Brown was undaunted. He continued to push on over the next 6 years. And in December of 1969, Brown again publicly proclaimed that the church was about to lift its ban. And he based his optimism, this optimism, on the fact that he had lobbied very hard among his fellow general authorities, members of the 12 and the First Presidency, to get them to go along, to convince them that the time really had come to lift the ban, to get rid of this odious practice. And I should mention there were a couple of things that kind of got in that should qualify this. The fact that David O. McKay took no part in these deliberations because he was close to death. He would be dead within the next month or so. This is late 1969. And more significantly, the senior apostle, Harold B. Lee, was absent. He was out of the country, as was Alvin R. Dyer, a First Presidency counselor. Both Lee and Dyer were hardliners on the issue of race, and they strongly opposed lifting the ban. So seizing the moment, you know, Harold B. Lee, Hugh B. Brown, secures this majority support from those who are present. However, when Lee and Dyer returned, things changed drastically, because you can imagine Lee was just absolutely irate. He was beside himself. This had been done behind his back, and he was probably the most powerful church leader at that time, because Micaiah Sain was on the verge of death. The other apostle ahead of him, President Smith, he was not in the best of health either, and so what Lee did is took the bull by the horns. He sits down and he drafts a statement of his own, which doesn't rescind it, but does just the opposite. It reaffirms that black priesthood denial is a doctrine, and he persuades the majority of the quorum of the 12 to go along with him. And then Lee and his colleagues, after Lee has got their support, pressured Brown into signing the statement affirming, the 1969 statement affirming black priesthood denial. I mean, it sort of reminds me a little bit of the movie The Godfather, where he certainly makes Brown an offer he can't refuse, and a line in that movie I remember says, either your signature or your brains are going to be on this document. It's, you know, it doesn't. That's a little bit putting it in a little bit of an extreme way, but Brown, you know, agrees. I mean, he's just brokenhearted. In fact, the reports are that he's actually sobbing as he's having to affix his signature to this document affirming a black priesthood denial. And the document itself is interesting because it, as I say, it reaffirmed the 49 doctrine, or the 49 statement, official statement, that black priesthood denial is a doctrine. The statement dated the 15th of December, 1969, is a curious document because it's signed by only the two members of the first presidency, Hugh B. Brown and Eldon Tanner. Because McKay is increasingly feeble. He, as I say, he's on the doorstep of death. He'll be dead within a month, and so he's not even capable of signing the document. And the statement states that the ban as doctrine, quote, and this is right from the document itself, is something that originated is not something that originated with man. It's important to keep that in. It's not something that originated in man, but goes back to the beginning with God. Adding the blacks were not yet to receive the priesthood for reasons we believe are known to God, but which he has not made fully known to man. It further states that God is discriminatory to those whom he grants the priesthood, but then goes on to say the following: sometime in God's eternal plan, the Negro will be given the right to the priesthood. The statement also proclaimed, but one additional thing in this document, it went on to proclaim LDS support for civil rights, you know, thereby reaffirming what Brown had put together back in 1963. And the reason that it included that was to convince Brown insisted that being in there as a precondition for his signature. But I further hasten to point out that conspicuously absent in the 69 document is any mention of a divine curse on blacks or anything linking blacks to a pre-earth life misbehavior or other alleged transgressions that, as I say, were points of dogma in the 49 document. And so, in conclusion, the LDS position on civil rights, it became more enlightened, you know, by virtue of the 63 statement, whereas by contrast, the policy with regard to black priesthood denial was hardened into doctrine that could only be rescinded through divine revelation. That's it.